Human behavior in relationships often follows patterns that are visible only in hindsight. One of the most puzzling among them is this: why do some men seem unable to lose interest even long after a relationship has ended or a connection has faded? At first glance, the answer seems simple. Perhaps it's emotional immaturity, attachment issues, or even ego. But psychology teaches us that human attraction is rarely that shallow. What appears to be never losing interest is often a complex interaction between biological wiring, emotional conditioning, and philosophical self-definition. To understand this phenomenon, we must first ask, what does it mean to lose interest? In behavioral terms, losing interest should signify the withdrawal of attention, motivation, or desire toward a person or object. Yet when we observe many men, especially those reflecting on past relationships, we notice a contradiction. They might move on physically, but mentally, a trace of emotional involvement persists. This is not obsession, nor pure nostalgia, but a deeper cognitive echo of attachment. In psychology, this echo can be linked to the reward prediction error, a concept in neuroscience where the brain continues to anticipate a reward even after the source of that reward disappears. Relationships, especially those involving emotional intimacy, activate the same dopamine pathways as ambition, success, or achievement. Once formed, these circuits don't immediately dissolve. They wait for closure that rarely arrives in emotional life. Philosophically, this brings us to an even more profound layer: the relationship between desire and identity. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer and later psychoanalytic theorists argued that desire is not just about acquiring an object, it's about defining the self through pursuit. When men desire someone, they're often constructing a version of themselves that exists in relation to that person. So when the relationship ends, the person's departure doesn't erase the image, it leaves an incomplete narrative, a psychological gap. This gap explains why many men revisit old messages, replay conversations in their minds, or find themselves unexpectedly reminded of someone years later. It's not because they're incapable of moving on, it's because psychologically, the self they built in that connection never fully disintegrated. Understanding this dynamic isn't just about men or relationships. It's about the architecture of the human mind. Our identities are not static. They are relational. Every attachment, whether romantic or platonic, leaves behind an imprint that shapes how we perceive love, loss, and meaning. So the real question isn't why men never lose interest, but why the human mind refuses to forget emotional patterns that once defined its sense of self. In this video, we'll explore this mystery through three lenses: evolutionary psychology, cognitive behavior theory, and existential philosophy, to uncover what truly happens beneath the surface of male attachment, and why the idea of losing interest might be more illusion than fact. Section 1. The evolutionary foundation of male interest. From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, male attraction and sustained interest are not random. They stem from adaptive strategies deeply rooted in the survival and reproduction of the species. Across evolutionary history, male reproductive success depended less on emotional detachment and more on the capacity to recognize, pursue, and maintain valuable connections. Men are naturally inclined toward what psychologists call mate retention behaviors, both conscious and unconscious actions aimed at preserving access to a valued partner. These behaviors, though originally biological, have evolved into emotional and cognitive patterns. When a man never loses interest, it may not mean he still desires that person romantically. Instead, it may indicate that his brain still recognizes the partner as a valuable stimulus, one associated with reward, belonging, or self-validation. Neuroscientifically, this ties into the dopaminergic system, the network that governs motivation and anticipation. Dopamine doesn't respond merely to pleasure. It responds to potential, to the anticipation of reward. So when a man remembers someone who once made him feel alive, accepted, or powerful, his brain reactivates the dopamine circuitry that was once linked to that individual. This is why, even years later, men might find themselves unexpectedly reminded of a person they thought they had forgotten. The neural pathways, once strengthened by emotional experience, remain latent, waiting for triggers. This phenomenon, known as emotional reactivation, shows that attraction and interest are not purely emotional choices. They are neurochemical memories encoded in the brain's reward system. Philosophically, this suggests something profound. The human mind does not easily release what once gave it purpose. Schopenhauer famously observed that desire is like a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. When men lose the immediate object of desire, the pendulum does not stop. It simply swings into the realm of memory, turning desire into reflection. Section 2. Ego, Identity, and the Psychology of Validation. In the psychological domain, interest is rarely only about the other person. It is about the self in relation to the other. For men, societal conditioning often intertwines romantic attention with ego reinforcement. From early development, many men are subtly taught that their worth is proven by achievement in career competition and relationships. In relationships, this extends to being chosen, admired, or needed. When that external validation disappears, a man may unconsciously continue to seek it, not because he desires the person, but because his identity was tied to the approval they represented. Psychodynamic theory explains this through narcissistic supply, the emotional fuel drawn from feeling valued and desired. When that supply is cut off, the ego doesn't simply adapt, it seeks continuity. The mind replays interactions, imagines alternative outcomes, and romanticizes the past to restore equilibrium. Even existentialist philosophers, like Jean-Paul Sartre, emphasize that identity is performative. We exist through our actions and through how others perceive us. If a relationship once defined a man as strong, desirable, or meaningful, its absence can create what psychologists call ego dissonance. The man doesn't necessarily miss the person, he misses the version of himself that existed when that person was present. This is why, after breakups, many men experience what researchers describe as delayed emotional processing. They appear fine initially, calm, rational, even detached. Yet months or years later, when their sense of self stabilizes, the unresolved emotions resurface. They are not re-falling in love. They are revisiting the parts of themselves that were once alive within that dynamic. In essence, men rarely lose interest because what they're attached to is not always the person. It's the psychological reflection of their identity in that relationship. Section 3. Emotional imprinting and memory retention. Cognitive psychology reveals another dimension. Emotional memory does not fade uniformly. When we experience a strong emotional connection, the brain releases neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine, which strengthen synaptic connections. The stronger the emotional experience, the deeper the memory trace. This process, known as emotional imprinting, ensures that emotionally charged experiences, love, rejection, admiration, loss, remain easily accessible. For men, this can manifest as recurring thoughts, dreams, or sudden emotional waves triggered by sensory stimuli, a song, a scent, a location, Research in effective neuroscience shows that men and women process emotional stimuli differently. On average, men's amygdala, the emotional center, tends to store and retrieve visual and contextual cues more strongly than verbal details. This means men are more likely to recall an image, a specific facial expression, or a scene rather than the verbal narrative of the relationship. This also explains why men may be haunted by moments, not words. Furthermore, memory and emotion are recursive systems. When an emotional memory is recalled, it becomes reconsolidated, often with stronger associations. So every time a man recalls a person from his past, he doesn't just remember, he re-experiences. This loop reinforces the sense that he has never fully lost interest, when in fact, it is the brain's way of replaying unresolved emotional data. Philosophically, this resonates with Plato's concept of anamnesis, the idea that knowledge, and by extension, emotion, is recollection. The mind cannot truly unlearn what it has once internalized as meaningful. Thus, a man's persistent memory of someone may not be a choice, but a testament to how deeply that person influenced his sense of reality. Section 4. The chase versus connection. Psychology also distinguishes between pursuit-driven attraction and attachment-driven affection. Men often conflate the two. The chase activates competitive and dopaminergic systems, anticipation, uncertainty, and the thrill of pursuit. But genuine connection involves oxytocin, empathy, and vulnerability. When relationships end, the loss of the chase can feel like the loss of meaning. The reward cycle ends abruptly, leaving behind what neuroscientists call a reward void. This is particularly visible in avoidant or dismissive attachment styles, where individuals resist vulnerability yet crave validation. Such men may appear emotionally distant, but internally, their minds continue the chase long after the external relationship has ended. Their interest persists as a psychological pattern, not an emotional one. Attachment theory, Bobby Ainsworth, explains that early childhood experiences of security or neglect heavily shape adult relationships. Men with inconsistent early attachments often replay unresolved dependency patterns, drawn repeatedly to people who resemble their emotional blueprint. When they never lose interest, it may reflect a subconscious attempt to rewrite that early emotional narrative. Philosophically, this dynamic aligns with Kierkegaard's idea of repetition, the human tendency to relive experiences in search of meaning or closure. For many men, sustained interest is not about holding on to someone, it's about re-seeking the version of the self that once felt whole. Section 5. The psychological loops of desire. At the deepest level, the persistence of male interest can be understood through reinforcement loops, psychological patterns that recycle unresolved emotion. In behavioral psychology, when a stimulus, the person, is associated with intermittent reward, attention, affection, validation, it becomes particularly resistant to extinction. This is known as variable ratio reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Emotional attachment operates similarly. A relationship that provided unpredictable highs and lows leaves a stronger imprint than one that was consistently stable. Thus, when men remember a past partner intensely, it's often because that relationship existed in the realm of uncertainty, where every emotional win carried amplified reward. The unpredictability itself becomes addictive. Philosophers like Lacan interpreted this as the object of desire, the idea that humans do not desire the object itself, but the lack it represents. Men, in particular, may fixate on someone precisely because she symbolizes something unfulfilled, an ideal, a loss, or a version of self-acceptance that feels incomplete. From this perspective, never losing interest is not about attachment to the person, but attachment to the idea, the fantasy of completion. This aligns with Freud's notion of repetition compulsion, the drive to unconsciously reenact unresolved emotional scenarios in hopes of mastering them. Every time a man revisits a memory, checks an old photo, or wonders, what if? He is not simply reminiscing. He is attempting to complete a story his subconscious refuses to leave unfinished. Section 6: Cultural Conditioning and Gender Expectations. Social conditioning plays an undeniable role. Men are often discouraged from expressing emotional vulnerability, creating a paradox. They feel deeply but process slowly. Society frames detachment as strength, so men suppress grief or longing rather than integrate it. This repression often manifests later as persistent interest, not because the emotion never faded, but because it was never processed. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It remains suspended until the psyche is ready to confront it. In this sense, male persistence in interest is not a flaw, but a symptom of cultural silence around male emotional life. The illusion of disinterest hides a deeper emotional backlog. Philosophically, this recalls the Stoic misunderstanding of emotional suppression. Ancient Stoics never taught detachment as denial. They taught understanding emotion to transcend it. Modern masculinity, however, often interprets Stoic ideals as repression, leaving many men emotionally fragmented. The result? A pattern where men seem to never lose interest, when in reality, they were never allowed the psychological tools to properly let go. When we examine the question, why men never lose interest through a more analytical lens, we find that it sits at the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and human existentialism. It's not merely about romance or gender. It's about how consciousness deals with attachment, memory, and meaning. 1. The psychological paradox of attachment. Human attachment is both a survival mechanism and a vulnerability. Evolution designed it to promote pair bonding and cooperation. But in modern contexts, it often becomes a psychological paradox. Men who appear unable to lose interest are in essence trapped within this paradox, torn between the biological need for connection and the societal expectation of emotional independence. Attachment theory helps decode this tension. Insecure attachment types, especially avoidant and anxious avoidant patterns, are prone to ambivalence. They may withdraw outwardly while remaining emotionally fixated internally. This explains why men can seem detached, yet remain mentally occupied with the same person for years. The attachment system remains activated, but unfulfilled, perpetuating the illusion of lasting interest. This reveals an important insight. Unresolved emotional bonds do not fade through avoidance, they fade through integration. Until the emotional narrative is consciously processed through reflection, closure, or new meaning, it remains active in the unconscious. Hence, the mind keeps returning to it, not out of desire, but to complete an unfinished pattern. 2. The ego's need for continuity. Psychologically, the ego is a storyteller. It seeks coherence, a linear, meaningful self-concept that connects past, present, and future. When a relationship ends abruptly, it disrupts that continuity. The ego cannot tolerate narrative gaps. Therefore, even when rationally detached, a man may keep revisiting the past in an attempt to rewrite the story in a way that makes sense. This behavior aligns with the psychoanalytic concept of the compulsion to repeat. Freud observed that individuals unconsciously repeat unresolved emotional situations in different forms, hoping for a new outcome that restores equilibrium. The persistence of interest then becomes a coping mechanism, a subconscious strategy to reclaim narrative stability. Philosophically, this mirrors Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, the notion that humans are destined to relive the same emotional cycles until they learn to transform them consciously. Men who never lose interest may not be in love. They may be stuck in a cycle of self-recognition, trying to find closure that the external world cannot provide. 3. The role of meaning and the existential self. Existential psychology offers another dimension. Human beings, as Viktor Frankl emphasized, are meaning-seeking creatures. Every relationship, even brief ones, represents a source of meaning, a reflection of who we are and what we value. When that meaning is lost or questioned, the psyche doesn't just miss the person, it misses the significance that person brought into existence. For many men, relationships act as mirrors through which they understand purpose, validation, and identity. The loss of that mirror creates what existentialists call the void, a psychological emptiness where meaning used to reside. To fill this void, the mind returns to what once gave it coherence. This reattachment is not necessarily emotional, it's ontological, a search for being. Thus, when men appear to never lose interest, it may not be about affection at all. It is often about reclaiming existential coherence, restoring a sense of who they are in a world where the relationship once defined their emotional reality. Emotional reinforcement and the illusion of permanence. Behavioral psychology adds yet another layer. Emotional experiences, especially those reinforced intermittently, create the illusion of permanence. When affection or validation was unpredictable, the mind encoded it as special, something rare, and therefore memorable. The man's brain continues to seek that same unpredictability, mistaking anticipation for emotional attachment. This is why never losing interest often coincides with unresolved uncertainty, the relationship that could have been, the conversation that never ended, or the closure that never came. The human mind doesn't crave completion, it craves understanding. Without understanding, it replays the same narrative endlessly. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described this as the anxiety of possibility, the haunting awareness of what might have been in relationships. This transforms into a psychological loop of maybe it could have worked, maybe it still matters. These mental simulations can sustain emotional energy long after the relationship itself has ceased to exist. 5. Masculinity, emotion, and cultural programming. A broader cultural analysis exposes how male psychology is shaped by social conditioning. From a young age, men are taught to suppress vulnerability, to equate emotional control with strength. As a result, emotional experiences are often processed intellectually rather than emotionally. When loss occurs, men rationalize it instead of grieving it. Yet grief is not optional. It merely hides beneath the surface until triggered. What appears as long-term interest is often repressed grief, expressing itself through nostalgia, curiosity, or lingering attachment. This dynamic is reinforced by societal double standards. Men are told to move on, while women are socially allowed to feel. Over time, emotional suppression becomes habitual, and unprocessed emotion becomes chronic memory. Hence, some men may appear emotionally stable, when in reality, they're emotionally static, caught in suspended reflection. Philosophically, this represents a distortion of the Stoic idea of emotional mastery. The Stoics taught awareness without attachment, but modern masculinity often practices denial without awareness. The result is not freedom from emotion, but imprisonment within it. 6. The broader human truth. Ultimately, this topic transcends gender. The question why men never lose interest is a reflection of a universal human struggle, the difficulty of letting go of experiences that shaped our sense of self. Memory, meaning, and emotion intertwine so deeply that the boundaries between them blur. What men experience as persistent interest is, in many ways, the psyche's testament to how deeply connection defines identity. The more authentic the bond, the more profound its echo in consciousness. Philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote that being is always being with. Our existence gains meaning through relation to people, to the world, to the self we imagine through others. When one of those relationships ends, a fragment of being with remains unanchored, searching for new meaning. That is why detachment is not the same as forgetfulness. Detachment is acceptance, while forgetfulness is denial. To lose interest, then, is not merely to stop caring. It is to integrate the experience into one's narrative, to accept that what was once significant has served its purpose in shaping who we have become.
Challenge reflection for the viewer.
So, what can we learn from this? Perhaps the real message isn't that men never lose interest, but that humans never fully outgrow the emotions that once defined them. Our attachments leave behind neural and philosophical imprints that remind us of our capacity for connection. If we see these imprints not as signs of weakness, but as reminders of emotional depth, we may begin to understand relationships and ourselves with greater compassion. In understanding why men never lose interest, we've uncovered something far deeper than a gendered phenomenon. What seems like emotional persistence is in reality a reflection of how the human mind binds memory, identity, and meaning together into a single psychological framework. Men, like all humans, are driven by the need for coherence, to make sense of who they are through what and whom they love. When a relationship ends, that coherence is disturbed. The emotional imprint doesn't vanish simply because logic tells it to. It lingers, replaying in the background of consciousness until it finds integration. From an evolutionary viewpoint, this persistence once ensured survival by keeping bonds intact and motivating pair protection. From a cognitive perspective, it's a byproduct of reward pathways that still anticipate emotional closure. And from a philosophical standpoint, it is a mirror reflecting the self, a search for continuity amid the impermanence of experience. The phrase "never losing interest" is therefore misleading. It suggests stagnation, when in fact, it often represents an incomplete emotional process. Men do not necessarily remain attached to people they once loved. They remain attached to the version of themselves that existed within that emotional landscape. The interest persists because the story remains unfinished, and human beings by nature long for narrative completion. This understanding reframes the idea of emotional endurance from something problematic into something profoundly human. Persistent interest is not obsession. It is resonance. It is the psyche's reminder that our capacity to connect leaves behind traces that do not weaken us, but expand us. To move on, then, is not to erase those traces, but to understand them. Integration, not avoidance, is what transforms lingering attachment into self-awareness. When a man accepts that his enduring thoughts are not failures of detachment, but evidence of depth, he begins to reclaim emotional maturity, the kind that transcends denial and reaches acceptance. Philosophically, this journey aligns with the Stoic principle of amor fati, the love of one's fate. To embrace all experiences, even painful ones, is essential to the formation of the self. Every relationship, whether lasting or brief, becomes a teacher of identity. Every attachment, even those that fade, reveals something about what we value, seek, and fear. So, why do men never lose interest? Because memory is not mechanical, because emotion is not disposable, and because the human mind, rational yet longing, is designed not to forget, but to understand. As you reflect on this, consider this closing thought. The people we cannot forget are not always those we still love. Sometimes they are the ones who taught us who we are capable of becoming. If this video gave you a deeper insight into human psychology, consider sharing it with someone who values understanding over judgment. Leave a comment below. What do you think defines true detachment? And most importantly, remember, awareness is not about erasing your past. It's about learning how to live wiser because of it.